One thing you'll probably want to add to your site are images. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you've got a folder to hold your images, and you'll place your image files inside here. Let's talk briefly about image file format. Digital cameras and smartphone cameras by default use the JPEG format, and those have the .jpg, or sometimes you'll see .jpeg extensions. And JPEG will dramatically reduce the size of the image file by running some algorithm that removes data from the file. But for photographs, in most cases, it's going to be totally fine for the web. And the resolution in pixels per inch, 72 is generally fine. PNG is another file format you'll see frequently. PNG files have higher quality than JPEG files because while they do compress the files, they retain the quality. So it's going to be larger file sizes, but the definition is going to be clearer. For diagrams and charts and logos and things like that, you're going to want to use a PNG file over a JPEG file. And another file type you'll see sometimes are SVG files. Those are vector graphics. The first two file types we talked about, JPEG and PNG, are bitmap files, sometimes called raster files. And they have grids of pixels. And a pixel is a square dot that has a color assigned to it. SVG files, on the other hand, are vector images. The SVG file contains a mathematical formula that sets shapes and colors and positions and lines of what your image is going to look like. The advantage of an SVG file or a vector file over a bitmap file is you can change the size of these files and it's not going to impact quality. If you increase a JPEG or PNG file above its normal size, it's going to start to look a little blurry. That won't happen with a vector file. Vector files are often used for icons and sometimes for logos and that type of thing. Now let's talk about the image HTML element. IMG is the image tag. It's an empty element, meaning there's no closing tag. It's got one required attribute, that's the source, the location of the file. That location can be an absolute URL. So this is the full path. This is the image right here. Save it. It's the same. If we undo that, use the relative path, it's going to go into this images folder and get this file, placeholder x.jpg. Save it. And we're still accessing the image. Now when using a relative path, which excludes the domain name, it can either be relative from the file it's called in or relative from the web project's root. If he uses /, it's going to be relative from the web project's root. If you leave it out, then it's going to be relative from this file. Now let me save this, and it's not going to work. And the reason for that is we need to go up one directory with 2 dots. So we're right here. We go up one directory to get into the root and then into images. Now let's save it again. There we go. Generally, you're going to want to use the root directory in your paths. Save it. Now let's talk about the alt attribute. This attribute is not required, but it's strongly recommended, and it serves 2 purposes. First, if the image doesn't load for some reason, like if the path is invalid, let me save this, it will display your alt text. The second purpose is for accessibility. If the user has the screen reader turned on, the screen reader will announce that there's an image and it will read the alt text. Now if the image is just for decorative purposes, then go ahead and leave this blank. Keep the alt attribute there, but just with no text, and then the screen reader will just skip over it. Now let's talk about the width and height attributes. Now we've normally been setting width and height as a CSS style rule, but here notice that they're actually HTML attributes. And the units are always in pixels, so you just put the number without px. Now we could also set it in the CSS as a style rule. It really doesn't matter whether you do it here or in the CSS. As a rule of thumb, if you're going to have multiple images with the same width and height, you might want to create a style rule. But if each image is going to have its own width and height, you might just use the HTML attributes directly. If there's a conflict, in other words, if it's set in both the CSS and as attributes here, the CSS takes precedence. All images have an intrinsic size. You can get the intrinsic size of your image just by opening it up. If you're on a Mac, you can right-click it and open it with Preview. And if you go to Tools, Adjust Size, it'll give you the width and height. Here it's 200 pixels. And you can actually change it if you want to. It's actually not a bad idea to save your images in the size that you want to display them as. That way the browser doesn't have to readjust it. And notice it's resolution of 72, which is fine for the web. If you change it here to 400, it'll automatically scale the height using the same aspect ratio, which is 1:1 in this case. So here we're setting the width and height to 150. If we remove it and save it, then it will display at the intrinsic height of 200 by 200. Let's put it back. You could also leave out one of the dimensions, and the browser will calculate the missing dimension based on the image's width to height ratio, also called the aspect ratio. Put it back. Alternatively, you could distort the image by changing one of the dimensions. Save it. We changed the width to 450 and it stretched it way out here. Now let's do something else. Let's change it to 850, and it stretched it all the way off the page. So we can make it responsive. We've got a couple classes here, rounded and IMG fluid. Let's go to the CSS. First of all, rounded is from the box model, and it rounds the corners here. We've already defined that. But if we want to make it responsive, then what we can do is set the maximum width to 100% of the available screen, and then set the height to auto, which means it will automatically calculate the height. Let's save it. Because the width is 850, it's greater than the screen, so then the CSS kicks in and it sets the max width at 100%. Let's stretch it out, and you can see once it hits 850, it stays at that width. The other thing to notice, if we go back here, is we've set both width and height, but we overrode the height right here in the CSS. The CSS takes precedence over the height attribute in the element. So here we're setting it at auto, and it's ignoring this height of 150. Let's set it back. Another thing you can do is center the image. Just wrap the image in a div and set the div's class to text center. And if you want to add a caption, use the fig caption class and write your caption there, and then wrap the image and the fig caption in this figure class. And you can give it some style by changing the font size to make it a little smaller and making the text gray. Save it. There we go. And finally, we can float the image to the right or to the left. And what that does is it'll align the image to the left or to the right, and the text will float around it. Let's save this. And here we floated it to the end, and you can see the text wrapped around it. Now let's head over to the index page. What we want to do is add our site logo to the nav bar just to the left of this site name. This is the image we're going to load. Notice it's a PNG file, so it's got more detail. Also, PNG files allow for transparency in the background, whereas JPEG files do not. Let's go to the index page. This is the image tag. It's 25 by 25 pixels. Let's save it. And there we go. Looks good. Now let's do something else with the site icon. Let's make it our favicon. So favicon is what shows up in the browser tab. Right now it doesn't have a favicon at all. This is just some generic sign. Let's open up the head element. Add a link element in the head section of your web page. Set the href to your image location and use these attributes to indicate that it is a favicon. And we'll save it. Keep your eye up here. And there we go. Now we have our favicon. Now let's go down to the bottom here. And one thing we can do is add the icons next to each one of these social media links. Now where are we going to get these icons? There's a fantastic source that Bootstrap has called Bootstrap Icons. If you go to their website, along the top, one of the tabs is Icons. And here you've got many different icons that you can use. These are actually SVG files. You can search for one. Let's search for GitHub. Then click on it. And it gives you some options. You can download the SVG file and put it in your images folder and use it like any other image. Another way you can access them is as a CSS font. We'll take a look at how to do both of those. Let's go back to our code. You can see I've already downloaded the SVG files for the social media icons. And let's go down to the bottom in our footer. Now there are a number of ways we can display the icon image. One way is to actually copy and paste the SVG file directly into our HTML document. This is the formula that creates the image. And you can get that on their website just by copying that and pasting it. However, that can be a little verbose, especially if you have multiple images. So another option is what we've done. Download the SVG image and save it into our images folder, and then create an image tag and source the image directly. Let's go ahead and do that and see what it looks like. Let's save it. Get rid of this. Okay, so you can see the icon appeared just to the left of GitHub. Now a third option, and one that I like, is to use classes. Let's uncomment this and comment this out. Now to access the classes, we'll use the Bootstrap icon CDN, Content Delivery Network. Uncomment this. And this is another Bootstrap style sheet. You can see it ends in .css, and it'll give us all their icons, and we access the individual icon via a class. We put it inside an inline element. We're using the I element, like for icon. It could be a span element or whatever. The class is bi dash and the icon name. Bi stands for Bootstrap Icons. Let's do it for all of them. Save it. They're stacked because of responsiveness. There we go. And you can get that element also on their website. Just copy it right here and paste it into your code. Okay, let's connect to Bootstrap and make sure everything is still working correctly. Comment out our mimic Bootstrap style sheet and connect to the Bootstrap CDN. Let's go to the site and let's save it. Okay, everything seems to be fine. Then one last thing to do is to add images to our highlighted articles off to the right. It's optional, but it helps draw the reader's attention and makes a click-through potentially more likely, and the site a little more colorful, that type of thing. So we've just added some image tags to the right of each one of these articles, and we're using Bootstrap's responsive magic. So we can't see the images now because the screen is too narrow. Let's widen it. Boom, there we go. An image off to the right there. A little farther. And these articles also have an image to the right. And it's optional, so this one doesn't. So all we did was add image tags and use the Bootstrap grid. One thing to note, Here's how Bootstrap makes the images disappear when the screen is too small. This d-none class sets the display property to none, so this element won't be shown. This class d-lg-block, when the screen size is large, it sets display to block. Then this element becomes visible. And that wraps up this segment on images.